He stood at the top of the attic stairs with the fading light behind him, dust drifting through the air like tiny pieces of a truth he had never bothered to learn. Ethan Carter lifted a cardboard box with one hand, trying not to wrinkle the clean shirt he'd ironed that morning. Below him, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that always made him uneasy. His father was somewhere in the yard, probably patching that old beat-up truck again, the one Ethan wished he'd stopped driving. From where he stood, he could hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the low hum of a loose window rattling in the evening breeze, and the steady rhythm of his own breath. Everything smelled faintly of wood and forgotten years. He pushed aside a stack of worn jackets and a pair of work boots that had long lost their shine, feeling that usual blend of impatience and embarrassment rise in him. His father's things always made him feel small in a way he could never admit. This is Stories That Heal the Heart, where we walk through the quiet corners of ordinary lives and discover the truths waiting there. Truths about injustice, love, and the quiet power of forgiveness. These are stories of people who carry more inside them than the world ever sees, people whose hearts speak louder than their circumstances. If you've ever judged someone too quickly or wished you could take back a moment when pride spoke louder than love, this story is for you. Stay with me, because some truths only reveal themselves when we're finally still enough to hear them. Ethan brushed his hand across the top of an old shelf, the dust lifting into the air like a sigh. Something about the attic felt heavier tonight, as if it were holding its breath. He didn't know why he kept glancing toward a corner near the window where a thin line of warm amber light cut through the dim. He wondered, just for a second, why the sound of the wind against the glass felt like a memory trying to get in. No one in this town knew who his father used to be, not even Ethan. He thought he knew, thought he understood the man, the limits, the simple life. But he was wrong. And tonight was the night that truth would begin to surface. A page inside a forgotten book would change everything. A photograph would rewrite the story of a man Ethan had spent 20 years resenting. And none of it would come from words spoken aloud, only from what love had carried in silence. If stories like this remind you that goodness still exists in places we often overlook, feel welcome to like this video and subscribe so these quiet voices of hope can reach more hearts. The attic light flickered softly, settling over the spine of a dusty book lying half open on the floor as if waiting for someone to finally pick it up. Tonight we remember that even in silence, love still answers. The attic had always felt like another world in that small house. Quieter, older, carrying the weight of years that Ethan never cared to understand. He stepped deeper inside, brushing aside a hanging cord from an old light bulb that buzzed softly against the stillness. The single window at the far end held the last of the evening, a warm strip of gold slipping through the dusty glass and falling over boxes stacked like forgotten chapters. The air carried the faint scent of engine oil and pine. The smell of his father's life pressed into wood and fabric. Downstairs he could hear the low thud of a tool dropping onto concrete. David must have been leaning over the hood of that truck again, humming under his breath, the way he always did when he worked with his hands. Ethan sighed, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He'd spent years trying to outrun the embarrassment that rose in him whenever someone laughed at that old pickup or at the worn boots his father never bothered to replace. Those boots sat by the attic door now, splattered with mud that had dried and cracked like a memory. He nudged them aside with the edge of his shoe. The gesture was small, but the meaning inside him was bigger than he cared to admit. The boxes around him wore handwritten labels: Christmas, tools, Maggie's things. Letters fading as if the ink itself was forgetting. One box had no label at all, just a strip of yellowing tape holding the lid down. He pulled it toward him, and a cloud of dust lifted, drifting through that warm beam of light as though time were stirring awake. Inside were folded shirts, the kind his father used to wear years ago when Ethan was still small enough to ride on his shoulders. He remembered the texture of that fabric against his cheek, coarse, warm, smelling faintly of summer grass. He pushed the memory away. Ethan didn't like the softness that came with those moments, didn't like what they made him feel about a man he'd worked so hard to resent. Below the shirts was a metal tin. Inside it, buttons and screws clinked softly, a sound that struck something in him he didn't want to acknowledge. His father had always kept little things, every bolt, every washer, as if nothing in this world was too small to matter. Ethan had mocked him for it, laughing with friends behind his back, calling it junk collecting. But here, in the attic stillness, that clinking sound felt like a heartbeat. He closed the tin and slid it aside. A small gust of wind pressed against the attic window, rattling it just enough to stir the quiet. The sound repeated, soft and persistent, a loop that always filled this space whenever the weather shifted. It was almost comforting, though Ethan didn't notice that yet. He only felt a strange tug inside him, as if something in the house had been waiting for him to finally come upstairs. Near the window, a shelf sagged under the weight of books that hadn't been touched in years. Their spines leaned on one another like tired backs. Ethan moved toward them, brushing his hand along the edges. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to find something worth keeping before he threw the rest away. College had taught him to value the new, the polished, the impressive. Nothing in this attic fit that definition. One book slipped as he brushed past, falling open on the floor with a dull, echoing thud. Ethan crouched to pick it up, irritated by how much dust clung to his hands. The pages trembled slightly in the breeze from the window. Something thin and stiff was caught between them, a corner of worn paper peeking out like a breath held too long. He didn't pull it free yet. Instead, he set the book aside and continued sorting as if the moment were nothing. But a part of him kept circling back toward that page, toward that sliver of something waiting to be seen. Down in the yard, David paused his work, wiping his forehead with the back of a tired hand. He glanced toward the house, toward the attic window glowing with amber light. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though remembering a promise he'd once made to himself about the day Ethan might open one particular book. Then he bent again over the engine, quiet and steady, keeping that memory folded inside him like he always had. Ethan kept moving through the boxes. He lifted a faded jacket and shook it out, watching dust fall in a soft cloud. A small photograph fluttered from the pocket. Just a glimpse of a woman's smile before it slipped beneath a stack of papers. Maggie, his mother. He froze, the breath caught in his chest as if he'd been touched by something warm he wasn't prepared for. He didn't move the papers. He couldn't. The glimpse alone was enough to crack something deep inside, though he buried the feeling quickly. A soft creak came from the hallway, the old floorboard outside the attic door. That sound had always marked the end of day, the moment his father's steps approached to say goodnight. Ethan remembered being young, pretending to sleep just to hear those steps pause at his door. He wasn't sure when he started pretending not to hear them anymore. The wind brushed the window again, tapping lightly, a sound that returned like a quiet refrain. Every house has its own music, and this one had always sung in the key of sacrifice, though Ethan had never learned to listen. A distant car honked on the street below. A dog barked once. Somewhere a neighbor's child laughed. The world outside moved with the easy rhythm of evening settling, but the attic felt suspended in its own time, as if holding Ethan between two versions of himself. The boy who once knew tenderness, and the young man who now feared looking poor. He lifted another object. a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn smooth, softened by hands that had carried it through more life than Ethan understood. Inside were pages filled with his father's handwriting, sketches, lists, pieces of ideas. He traced a finger over a drawing of something he couldn't quite name. It looked like a sign, maybe a logo, maybe a dream. Ethan closed the notebook too fast, almost impatient. He didn't want pieces of a father he didn't understand. He wanted distance, clarity, something he could categorize. But the attic didn't offer such clean lines. A car door closed outside. Footsteps crunched over gravel. Ethan paused, listening without meaning to. He knew the sound of those steps. Steady, uneven, familiar. His father walking back toward the house. Ethan swallowed hard and turned away from the window. His foot struck the book he'd pushed aside earlier, the one with the corner of a photograph sticking out. He stared at it now, lingering longer than he meant to, drawn by something unspoken in that small sliver of captured past. The photograph was waiting. Its truth was waiting. But the moment of discovery hadn't come yet. Before he reached for it, Ethan brushed a hand along the edge of an old wooden chair, its seat smoothed by years of use. He remembered sitting in that chair as a child, swinging his legs while his father tied his shoes, fingers warm and patient. The memory came like a flicker, then disappeared again beneath the heaviness of growing up. Behind him, something shifted in a box. The soft slide of paper against cardboard. It was the kind of sound easy to ignore, yet somehow impossible not to notice. This attic was full of voices Ethan hadn't listened to in years. He finally knelt, pulling the book closer. The corner of the photograph gleamed faintly in the fading light, a muted hint of faces, of years, of choices. His fingers hovered over it, almost afraid to touch it. The injustice of this story, the one Ethan had been unknowingly writing for years, was not loud or dramatic. It was quieter, growing slowly inside him. Through every moment he judged his father by boots and truck and paycheck, never realizing that love sometimes hides in silence, waiting for its moment to speak. A soft tapping sounded on the attic door frame, not a knock, just the gentle shift of old wood as someone paused outside. Ethan didn't turn. He didn't have to. He knew the weight of that silence, the breath someone takes before deciding whether to speak or walk away. The presence lingered. Then footsteps receded. David had walked on, leaving his son alone in a room full of truths he wasn't ready to face. Ethan lowered his gaze to the photograph still half hidden in the book. He wasn't ready, but the truth was, and the attic felt it. The photograph didn't wait for courage. It simply lay there, half born from the pages of that forgotten book, a silent truth pressing against the air. Ethan sat back on his heels, the wood beneath him cold, the attic suddenly too still. That strip of paper, no bigger than a fingertip, held more gravity than the entire room. He reached for it with a kind of hesitant irritation, as though annoyed by how much space it was taking in his mind. His fingers trembled in the soft amber light, not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt. When he pulled the photograph free, it came with the quiet whisper of old paper sliding against older paper, a sound that seemed to ripple through the attic like a sigh. He blinked. A young man stared back at him, strong posture, confident eyes, a smile so alive it felt like it had been caught mid-breath. His hair was thick, dark, wind-tossed, his hands steady, capable, rested on the neck of a guitar that looked worn from use, not neglect. Behind him, a small crowd blurred into soft shapes. People clapping, cheering, someone holding a banner Ethan couldn't fully read. The edges of the photo were frayed, the color faded, but the warmth was unmistakable. Ethan frowned. The man looked familiar, terribly familiar, but impossibly different from the father he knew. He flipped the photo over. 2 names were written in ink that had partly bled through the years: David Carter. Last night before the deal. Maggie, proud as ever. The words hit him like a breath, knocked out. He stared again at the man in the picture, but this time he wasn't seeing a stranger. He was seeing his father, 20, maybe 22, standing in the glow of a dream that had once belonged to him, a man alive with possibility, a man who looked nothing like the worn boots and tired eyes in the yard below. Ethan didn't move. Couldn't. He felt the edges of the photograph dig into his fingers, grounding him in a truth he had never allowed himself to imagine. His father had once been somebody. Not in the shallow, polished way Ethan measured success, not in wealth or status, but in the fullness of a heart chasing something it loved: music, expression, a future shaped by talent and passion. He looked for Maggie in the photo, but she wasn't in the frame. Still, Ethan could feel her there, behind the camera, capturing him with a pride that radiated through the image. His chest tightened, not with grief exactly, but with a longing he didn't have words for. He thought about the years after her death, the silence in the house, the way his father's movements had slowed, how the guitar that once leaned against the living room wall had vanished without explanation. He'd assumed it was sold, pawned, discarded. He never asked why. A soft creak came from the house below, a door closing, footsteps crossing the kitchen tiles, his father moving through his own memories without knowing Ethan was holding one of the deepest. Ethan lowered the photograph, his breath uneven. The attic suddenly felt different, less like a storage room, more like a confession. He slid his thumb along the bottom edge of the picture. There, just barely visible, was a second line of writing. The choice I made that night changed everything. He read it again and again. A choice. The word burrowed into him, unsettling something at his center. He looked around the attic with new eyes. The boxes weren't just boxes anymore. The boots weren't just boots. The old tin wasn't junk. Everything here was a map of a man who had lived, dreamed, lost, and kept going quietly, without applause or recognition. Ethan inhaled sharply. For the first time, the silence of the attic felt like his father's voice. He set the photograph beside him, gently now, as though afraid to disturb it. Then he reached back into the book, searching for more pages, more clues, more pieces of the man he had judged without mercy. There were none. But when he lifted the book, something else slid from beneath it. A folded sheet of paper, brittle with age. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. It was a letter, addressed in handwriting, unmistakably his mother's. David, if you're reading this, it means the decision is made. It means you chose us. I know what it cost you. I know what you walked away from, and I know our son will never understand unless the day comes when he's ready to hear it. If he ever finds this, let him see you the way I do. Not the musician who almost made it, but the man who chose love over applause. Ethan's heartbeat thudded through him. He read the letter twice, then a third time, his vision blurring at the edges. Outside, the last of the daylight surrendered to evening. Inside, something in Ethan, something hardened by years of pride, began to crack. He looked down at the photograph again, the young man smiling into a future he never lived. The father Ethan had never seen. He whispered into the quiet, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" The attic didn't answer, but the photograph did. It showed him everything his father had been before sacrifice turned him into a man the world overlooked. Ethan felt a weight he'd carried for years begin to shift, not disappearing, but reshaping itself into something heavy with truth. Below him, the house settled. A cupboard clicked. A sink dripped. Life moved on, unaware that something in the attic had already changed. Ethan pressed the photo to his chest, his breath uneven and warm against the stillness. For the first time in his life, he wasn't embarrassed by his father. He was humbled by him. Night settled slowly over the house, darkening the attic window until the world outside became nothing more than a faint reflection of Ethan's own silhouette. He sat on the floor with the photograph resting on his knee, the letter open beside him, the air thick with a silence that felt almost sacred. The truth had arrived quietly, without thunder or spectacle, and yet it struck harder than anything he'd ever known. For the first time, he wondered what dreams sound like when they're laid down gently for the sake of someone else. He wondered what it felt like for his father to walk off that stage, perhaps with applause still echoing behind him, and choose a life of early mornings, cheap boots, and unpaid bills because love asked for a different kind of greatness. Ethan's throat tightened. He tried to picture his father young, alive with music, standing before strangers who believed in him. He tried to imagine Maggie's hand in his father's, her soft smile urging him forward, believing in the man he was becoming. Then he pictured the night the decision was made, the deal he never took, the future he never lived, because they were expecting a child who would need him more than any stage did. That child was him. He leaned back against an old wooden beam, letting its roughness press into his spine. Something in him needed the grounding. The attic groaned softly as the night air cooled the roof. Wind nudged the window again, the pane rattling gently like a quiet knock from the past. He picked up the letter once more, reading his mother's words with slow, trembling care. Let him see you the way I do. Not the musician who almost made it, but the man who chose love over applause. Chosen. He had been chosen before he even had a name. He rubbed a hand across his face. Frustration and grief tangled in a knot inside him. How many years had he spent resenting a man who had given him everything? How many times had he rolled his eyes at those old boots, complained about that rusted truck, spoken with a tone that could cut without raising his voice? He felt each memory like a bruise pressing from beneath the skin. He didn't hear the attic door creak at first. The sound was so soft it almost slipped into the wind's rhythm. But a shadow appeared in the doorway, tall, familiar, shaped by years of quiet labor. His father didn't come inside. He simply stood there, the dim hallway light outlining the slope of his shoulders. His hands were still stained with work, the scent of engine oil faint but unmistakable. David Carter cleared his throat in that humble, hesitant way Ethan knew so well. You need anything up here? The words were plain, almost small, as though he didn't want to disturb the dust or the memories holding themselves open around his son. Ethan froze, the photograph suddenly burning in his hand. He didn't know how to speak yet, didn't know how to carry the weight of the truths pressed against his heart. He shook his head slowly. No, I'm fine. His voice cracked on the last word, but David didn't comment. He nodded once, simple, gentle. All right, just checking. He shifted as though to turn away, but something held him there. A pause that lingered, stretched, whispered of years spent wanting to reach his son but never finding the right doorway. Ethan glanced at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw more than worn boots and tired eyes. He saw a man who had lived two lives. One, the world applauded, and one the world never noticed. The second life, the quiet one, was the one he chose for Ethan. David rubbed the back of his neck, a shy, familiar gesture. Your mom, she always liked that attic. Said it felt like the house had a heartbeat up here. He gave a short chuckle, soft and uncertain. Never quite understood that, but I guess she was better at those kinds of things. Ethan swallowed hard. Dad, he whispered, but the word barely escaped him. There was too much behind it. Regret, awe, guilt, gratitude, all twisted together, too raw to speak clearly. David didn't step inside. He stayed at the threshold, respecting the distance his son had kept for years. Respecting a boundary he never complained about, never pushed against. You take your time, he said gently. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. He turned slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness. Ethan watched him go. The quiet shuffle of boots, the fading echo of footsteps down the stairs. When the sound disappeared, the attic felt heavier than before, as if holding its breath for the truth that had yet to be spoken. Ethan pressed his palm against the photograph again. He traced the smile on his father's young face, the life he never knew existed. The dream buried beneath years of sacrifice. He rose slowly to his feet. The attic floor groaned under his weight, the sound deep and old like a voice rising from memory. He moved to the window and looked out over the yard. The beat-up truck sat beneath the porch light, its battered hood reflecting a single faint glow. For the first time, Ethan didn't see embarrassment. He saw a symbol, not of poverty, but of a life redirected toward love. He pressed his forehead gently to the cool glass. Dad. The word left him in a breath, carried by the quiet ache of realization. He wasn't ready to face him yet. Not with words. Not with the flood of emotion threatening to break open. But he knew, with a clarity deeper than anything he'd felt before, that the story he'd built about his father was wrong, painfully, devastatingly wrong, and now that he knew the truth, he could never unsee it. He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand and turned back to the photograph, holding it with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. Somewhere downstairs, his father opened a cupboard, the quiet clatter drifting upward. A normal sound, a simple sound. Yet tonight, it felt like the world shifting, the foundation of their lives tilting just enough to let the light in. Ethan exhaled shakily. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight was the breaking. The quiet unraveling of a story built on pride. The first crack in a wall 20 years high. And in that fragile space between what he believed and what he finally knew, Ethan felt something stir inside him. Something that hurt. Something that healed. Something that whispered of forgiveness still waiting to be found. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the photograph resting on his nightstand, its edges glowing faintly in the streetlight, bleeding through the blinds. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw two versions of his father. The young man with a guitar and a dream, and the older man with tired hands and quiet eyes who had spent years believing his son would never see him clearly. He turned onto his side with a restless sigh. The house felt different now, as though the walls themselves were holding a truth he had ignored for too long. Down the hall, he heard the soft groan of his father's bed frame, the cough he always tried to stifle, the familiar rhythm of a man too used to enduring pain in silence. Guilt pressed against Ethan's ribs like something physical. Morning came in slow, pale strokes of light brushing across the floor. Ethan rose quietly, still holding the weight of everything he'd learned. He washed his face, ran a hand through his hair, and walked downstairs with steps that weren't quite steady. In the kitchen, David stood at the stove frying eggs in that same old pan he'd used since Ethan was a child. The pan was scratched, the handle wrapped in electrical tape, the surface worn thin from years of breakfasts cooked before school, before work, before life pushed them into different corners of the same home. David didn't turn when he heard Ethan enter. He just kept stirring quietly, the same calm, unassuming presence he'd always been. "Morning," he said. His voice was soft, roughened by sleep, or maybe by years of speaking gently into spaces where he feared he wasn't wanted. Ethan swallowed hard. "Morning." He sat at the table, fingers tapping nervously against the wood. He didn't know how to start, how to bridge a gap he had widened for so long. His father set a plate in front of him, simple and familiar. 2 eggs, toast, a slice of apple. The same breakfast he'd made every morning when Ethan was a boy. "Got a long day?" David asked as he poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "Maybe." Ethan stared at the plate but didn't eat. "Dad, can I ask you something?" David paused, mug halfway to his lips. "Sure." "There's a picture." Ethan's voice trembled. "Of you, with a guitar and some kind of show or event. It was in the attic." The kitchen fell silent except for the faint hiss of the cooling pan. David set his mug down slowly. His eyes softened, not with surprise, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had always known this day would come. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I figured you might find that someday." Ethan's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" David wiped his hands on a towel, leaning against the counter as though bracing himself. "Because it didn't feel important anymore." "But it was your dream." Ethan's voice cracked. "You had a chance, a real chance." David let out a breath that sounded older than him. Dreams change when life does. Ethan shook his head, desperate, hurting. "But you gave it up, for us, for me." David met his eyes then, really met them, with a gentleness that made Ethan feel like he was 10 years old again. "I didn't give it up," he said softly. "I made a choice. Your mother was sick. We had bills. And when we found out we were expecting you, I realized something." He paused, searching for the right words. "I realized applause fades. Stages disappear, but a child needs his father every single day." The truth hit Ethan with a physical ache. He felt the sting behind his eyes, but he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall just yet. "You could have told me," he whispered. David's smile was small, fragile. "Son, you never seemed too interested in the life I had before you came along. I didn't want to burden you with what-ifs." "Burden me?" Ethan leaned forward, voice shaking. "Dad, I judged you for things you sacrificed for me. I complained about your truck, your clothes, your job, not knowing you chose all of it over a future you could have had." David looked down at his hands. Rough, scarred, tired. "These hands were never meant for fancy things," he said quietly. "They were meant to work, to hold you, to keep this family afloat." He hesitated, then added in a voice so soft it nearly broke, "I was proud to do it." Ethan pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, trying to steady his breath. "I'm sorry," he finally choked out. David's eyes widened just slightly, as though he'd never expected to hear those words from his son. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said gently. "Yes, there is." Ethan's voice snapped under the weight of years. "I judged you. I acted like you weren't enough, like you were embarrassing." He pushed the plate away, unable to sit still. And all this time, you were someone I didn't even bother to know. David walked to the table and pulled out the chair beside him. He didn't touch Ethan, but his presence was enough. Grounding, steady, heartbreakingly patient. "You were a kid," he said softly. "Kids don't see the whole picture. And even when you grew older, well, life gets noisy. Pride gets loud." Ethan looked up, startled by how perfectly those words mapped his life. "But I never stopped loving you," David continued. "Not for a minute. Not even when you pulled away." Ethan covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. The dam finally cracked. Tears slid through his fingers, warm and bitter with regret. David didn't move for a moment, giving his son the space to break. Then with slow, uncertain hands, as though approaching a wild, wounded thing, he placed one hand on Ethan's back. It was a father's touch, gentle, steady, forgiving, before forgiveness was even asked. Ethan let out a sob he'd held for years. "I don't deserve that," he whispered. "You're my boy," David murmured, voice thick. "You'll always deserve love." Ethan leaned into the touch, crying harder now, decades of misunderstandings unraveling in his chest. His father's thumb rubbed soothing circles between his shoulders, the same way he used to when Ethan woke from nightmares as a child. After a long while, David spoke again. "You know," he said with a soft chuckle, "your mom always said you'd find that photograph when you were ready. Guess she was right." Ethan wiped his face, breath trembling. "I wish she were here." "Me too," David whispered. "She'd know what to say. She always did." Ethan nodded, staring at his hands. "Dad, I want to know everything. About the music, about what happened, about you." David's eyes shone with something like relief, a door finally opening after decades. "Then I'll tell you," he said. "All of it." The moment hung between them, fragile, luminous, trembling with the weight of healing finally beginning. Outside, morning settled over the yard, warm light touching the old truck, making the rust look almost golden. Inside, a father and son sat at a kitchen table, the same table that had witnessed years of silence, now holding a conversation that would change everything. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was the first step, the soft shift toward truth, the quiet beginning of forgiveness. They moved into the living room with their coffee mugs still warm in their hands. Morning light filtered through the curtains in soft stripes, settling on the old couch where Ethan had spent countless afternoons glued to video games while his father fixed something in the yard. Today, for the first time, the room felt like a place where truth belonged. David sat slowly, wincing just enough for Ethan to notice the stiffness in his movements. Years of labor had carved themselves into his joints, his back, his breath. Ethan felt another wave of guilt tighten around his chest. "Your mom used to sit right there," David said, nodding to the armchair across from them. "She always claimed it had the best light." A small smile tugged at his lips. "She said it made the house feel hopeful." Ethan sank into the armchair, the cushion sighing beneath him. "I barely remember her," he whispered. "Sometimes I feel like the memories I do have, they're fading." David nodded. "You were young, too young." He took a slow sip of coffee. "But she loved you more fiercely than anything. You were her whole world." Ethan bit down on the pressure rising in his throat. "Dad, what happened? With your music? With the deal?" David stared at the steam curling from his mug. For a moment, he seemed to slip into another life. "I was 22, he began quietly. "We were playing small venues, bars, fairs, little theaters. Nothing big, but enough to keep us dreaming." His eyes softened. "Your mother came to every show. She'd stand right up front, cheering louder than anyone. She believed in me long before I believed in myself. Ethan leaned forward, breath held. One night, a man approached me backstage, said he worked for a label, said he wanted to sign me. David chuckled faintly, shaking his head. I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. He gave me a card, told me to call him in the morning. What did Mom say? Ethan asked. She cried, David said, smiling sadly. Happy tears. She said my life was about to change. Ethan swallowed. And did it? David's face dimmed. Yes, just not in the way we expected. The heater clicked on in the quiet room. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street, but inside, time felt suspended. Your mom started feeling sick, David continued. At first it was nothing, just fatigue, dizziness, but then the doctor found complications with the pregnancy. He paused, voice thick. With you. Ethan stiffened. Me? David nodded. There were risks, big ones. The doctor said she needed bed rest, constant care, and a calm home environment. He looked down at his calloused hands. The label wanted me on the road, touring for months. No breaks, no stability. A silence stretched between them. What did you do? Ethan whispered, though he already knew the answer. David's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed soft. I chose to stay. Ethan pressed a hand to his chest, as if trying to steady the ache spreading there. They told me it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, David said quietly. And maybe it was. But your mom, she needed me. You needed me. And music. He paused, searching for the right words. Music would never forgive me if I traded my family for it. A tear slipped from Ethan's eye before he could stop it. She told me not to give it up, David continued. She begged me to take the deal, said she'd manage, but I couldn't leave her, not when she was fighting for her life. And yours. Ethan's breath shook. Dad, David exhaled slowly. I called the label the next morning, told them I couldn't sign the contract. He smiled faintly, almost amused by the memory. The man said I'd regret it, said I was throwing away my career. Did you? Ethan asked, voice barely a whisper. David's response was immediate. Never. Ethan felt the words settle into him like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, reshaping everything it touched. When you were born, David said softly, I held you and knew I'd made the right choice. Every dream I had shifted into something quieter, but deeper. Ethan wiped his face again, failing miserably to hide the tears. I can't believe I spent so many years treating you like you were less. David reached out, placing his hand gently on Ethan's arm. Son, life doesn't come with instructions. You saw what you saw. You understood what you could, and you were trying to build your own world. That's what young people do. But I hurt you, Ethan insisted. I pushed you away. I acted like you weren't enough. David's thumb brushed a comforting line across his arm. Love isn't measured by perfect years. It's measured by what survives the imperfect ones. Ethan cried harder at that, because he realized in that moment just how much love his father had carried silently. After your mom passed, David said softly, music became something I couldn't touch. Every chord reminded me of her, every melody hurt, so I put the guitar away. Ethan wiped at his eyes. Where is it now? David hesitated. In the garage, covered up. I haven't opened the case in years. Can I see it? Ethan asked, voice trembling. David blinked, surprised. You want to? I think I need to, Ethan said. They stood. For the first time in Ethan's life, he walked beside his father with reverence instead of resistance. He followed David into the garage where the faint smell of oil, dust, and old memories lingered. David reached for a shelf, pulling down a black case covered in a gray film. He placed it gently on the workbench as though handling fragile glass. His fingers lingered on the latches. "You sure?" he asked, meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan nodded. David flipped the latches open. The case creaked. The cloth lifted. And there it was. A guitar aged by time, but still breathtaking, its wood glowing softly even in the dim garage light. Ethan touched it reverently. "It's beautiful." David smiled. "It always was." "Play something," Ethan whispered. "Please." David's breath hitched, a barely noticeable tremor, as if the request had unlocked a door he'd kept sealed for decades. He lifted the guitar slowly, almost fearfully, as though it might shatter in his hands. He strummed one chord. The sound vibrated through the small space, warm and aching, stirring dust in the air and memories in their bones. Ethan's breath caught. It felt like hearing his father speak in a language he had forgotten he knew. David played another chord, then a third. A melody formed, hesitant at first, then settling into a familiar rhythm. "This was your mother's favorite," David murmured. Ethan closed his eyes as the music wrapped around him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Every note carrying love, loss, sacrifice, and everything his father had never said out loud. When the final chord faded, Ethan opened his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. David froze for a heartbeat, stunned, then held his son tightly, his hand lifting to the back of Ethan's head the way he used to when Ethan was small. "I'm here," David whispered. "I'm right here." And for the first time in years, they were. The days that followed moved with a tenderness neither of them had expected. Something unspoken but unmistakably new had settled into the house. An understanding, a gentleness, a shared breath between two hearts that had spent years speaking through closed doors. But healing never arrives all at once. It comes in quiet waves, soft and deep, asking us to face what we once turned away from. On the third evening, as the sky dimmed into a muted violet, Ethan found himself back in the attic. Not searching this time, listening. The space no longer felt like a vault of forgotten things, but a room still beating with the echoes of lives lived with love and sacrifice. He sat near the window where the photograph had first caught the dying light, letting the cool air brush against his face. The floorboards creaked as the house settled around him. Every sound now felt like an old friend, whispering truths he'd been too proud to hear. He pulled the photograph from his pocket. He didn't flinch anymore when he looked at it. Instead, he felt something rise in his chest, something warm, aching, alive. For years he had believed success made a man worthy. Now he saw that sacrifice did. He traced his father's young face with his thumb. A face filled with promise, with ambition, with a brightness he had never imagined belonged to the quiet man downstairs, tightening bolts and wiping grease from his hands. A soft knock echoed from the attic doorway. Ethan turned. Brian Thompson stood there, his father's old friend, taller now than Ethan remembered. Shoulders stooped from time, but eyes still sharp with a kind of stubborn loyalty. "Your dad said I might find you up here," Brian said as he stepped inside, his boots sending small puffs of dust into the air. "Mind if I join you?" Ethan shook his head. "No, please." Brian took a seat on an overturned crate, his bones settling with a quiet sigh. He looked around the attic as if greeting old ghosts. His eyes softened when they landed on the photograph in Ethan's hand. "You found it," he murmured. Ethan nodded. "Why didn't he ever tell me? Why did no one?" Brian took a long breath, rubbing his palms together slowly. "Your dad? He isn't the kind of man who keeps score. He doesn't brag, doesn't ask for applause. When he made that choice all those years ago, he buried the dream with the same hands he used to build your life." Ethan's voice cracked, but he shouldn't have had to bury it alone. Brian nodded with sympathy carved into every line of his face. "He didn't at first. Maggie was with him. And then life. It has a way of turning a man quiet when grief steals too much at once." Ethan lowered his eyes, guilt returning like an ache swelling beneath the ribs. "I judged him for things he never explained. He didn't want to load you with the weight of his sacrifices," Brian said softly. "That's the kind of father he is." Ethan swallowed. "I never asked. I never bothered to see." Brian leaned closer. "You know what your father asked me the night he turned down that deal?" Ethan shook his head. He asked if he was making a mistake, if one day his son would hate him for the life he could no longer give. Brian's voice trembled. "And I told him the truth, that if he stayed, he'd be choosing love over applause. And applause fades, Ethan. But love," his eyes glistened, "love remains." The words pierced Ethan like light through a break in the clouds. He turned the photograph over, reading the message his mother had written, now blooming with new meaning. "Do you know the whole story?" Ethan asked softly. Brian nodded. "Enough to tell you what your father never would." He paused, letting the moment settle between them. "Your father had the contract signed, pen on paper, everything ready." Ethan's breath caught. "But that night," Brian continued, "your mom collapsed backstage. No one knew she was sick yet. David carried her in his arms, running through the alley like the world was ending. At the hospital, they told him she'd lose the baby without immediate care. Complications were severe." Brian's voice softened. "Your father didn't hesitate. He tore up the contract in the waiting room trash bin, chose you both before the doctor even finished explaining what was at stake." Ethan pressed a hand to his mouth, a quiet sob escaping before he could hold it in. "You weren't just the reason he stayed," Brian said gently. "You were the reason he survived losing her. You kept him standing when grief nearly broke him." Ethan's tears fell freely now, darkening the photograph in his hand. "And all these years," he whispered, "I treated him like he wasn't enough." Brian placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Son, the hardest truths in life aren't the ones we discover. They're the ones we admit." The attic fell into a gentle stillness, the kind that wraps itself around a heart learning how to beat differently. After a moment, Brian stood. "There's something you should see," he said. "Downstairs, in your father's room." Ethan followed him down the narrow steps, every footstep echoing like a heartbeat. They entered David's small bedroom, a simple space with a worn quilt, a nightstand, and a few framed photos. Brian opened the top drawer. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each one marked with the same looping handwriting for Ethan. "Open when you're ready." Ethan's breath shattered. He lifted the first envelope, hands trembling. Inside was a letter. "I'm proud of you. Proud of, even when you don't see me, I see you. Even when you feel far, I love you close." Another envelope, another letter. "You don't need to shine for me to love you. You don't need to succeed for me to stay." Envelope after envelope, a lifetime of unspoken love poured into pages Ethan had never known existed. He sank onto the edge of the bed. Letters spread across his lap like pieces of a heart he had broken without understanding. Brian placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father never stopped choosing you." A sob tore through Ethan, raw, unfiltered. The kind that comes not from sadness but from the unbearable weight of love finally seen. Upstairs, the attic window rattled softly in the evening wind. Downstairs, a son wept into the remnants of a father's silent devotion. And somewhere in the quiet of that small house, healing waited, patient and steady, for the moment their hearts would meet again. The house was quiet that night, quiet in a way that didn't feel empty, but expectant. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, the stack of letters beside him, each one a small heartbeat of a father who had loved without needing to be seen. The photograph lay at the center of the table, illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead lamp. His mother's handwriting, looping and gentle, pressed against the wood like a blessing lingering through time. Outside, crickets murmured in the yard. A breeze nudged the porch swing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. But inside, the quiet carried weight, an invitation, a reckoning, a chance. David stepped into the kitchen slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He froze when he saw the letters spread before his son, the envelopes he had tucked away for years, waiting for a day he wasn't sure would ever come. Ethan looked up, breath trembling. "Dad, why didn't you give these to me?" David set a hand on the back of the chair, steadying himself. "Because you weren't supposed to carry what they held, not until you wanted to know me, not until you were ready." Ethan lowered his gaze, emotion tightening his throat. "I was wrong about you, about everything." David let out a soft breath as he eased into the chair opposite him. "Son, every man has to break a little before he can see clearly. I just hoped, when that time came, you'd still find me here." Ethan pushed one of the letters toward him. "I didn't know how much you love me." David's eyes glistened, reflecting years of holding back tears that had nowhere to fall. "I loved you quietly, not perfectly, but with everything I had left after losing your mother." They sat in silence, the air warm, charged, fragile. Ethan reached for the photograph again, turning it so his father could see. "This was you. This was your life. And I treated you like you were less because of a truck, because of old boots, because I was ashamed of things that were only signs of sacrifice." David swallowed hard, his voice low. "I didn't want you to feel the weight of what might have been." "But that wasn't your burden to carry alone," Ethan said. "It should have been ours." For a moment, David looked away, blinking back the tide rising in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "You always reminded me of her, not just in your face, but in your fire. I didn't want my story to dim yours." The word struck something deep, tender, unsteady inside Ethan. He rose, walked around the table, and placed the photograph gently in front of his father. "Dad, I want to hear the whole story, every part, not because I'm ready, because I need to understand the man who raised me." David lifted the photo with hands that shook as though touching an old wound, an old love. His thumb brushed across the young man he once was, the man who had sung under bright lights with a future stretching wide before him. "I haven't looked at this in 20 years, he whispered. Ethan crouched beside him. "Then look at it with me." David stared at the picture for a long time, so long that Ethan wondered if he'd speak at all. But eventually, David's lips curved into the faintest, softest smile. "She took this," he said. "Your mom. Just before I went on stage. She said I looked like a man standing on the edge of his destiny." He laughed then, a warm, broken sound. Turns out she was right, just not in the way either of us thought. Ethan placed a hand on his father's arm. Do you regret it? David didn't answer right away. He looked at the photograph, at the edges frayed by time, at the young man holding a guitar like a promise. Then he shook his head, slowly, firmly. No, because that stage would have given me applause. His voice softened. But loving you gave me purpose. Ethan couldn't speak. His breath came in small, jagged pulls as he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around his father, gripping him as though anchoring himself to something he'd been drifting from for years. David returned the embrace with a strength Ethan hadn't felt since childhood, steady, warm, whole. For a long time, they stayed there. Two men bound by the same grief, the same love, the same rediscovered truth. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan wiped his eyes and inhaled shakily. Dad, tomorrow, will you teach me? The guitar, the music, the songs you used to play? David blinked, stunned. You want to learn? I want to know the parts of you I never saw, Ethan said. The parts I never asked about. David pressed his fist gently to his mouth, shaking with emotion he tried and failed to contain. I'd like that, he whispered. They stood and walked to the doorway, stopping beneath the hall light where the shadows softened around them. Dad, Ethan said quietly. Yes, son? I'm proud of you. David closed his eyes, a single tear slipping free. I've waited a long time to hear that. They stepped into the living room, where the old guitar, now resting against the couch, waited in the dim glow as though a piece of David's past had been placed gently into their present. You know, David said with a small smile, your mom always believed our story wasn't finished. She said one day you'd see me. Ethan touched the guitar case, letting his fingers rest on its worn handle. I see you now. And for the first time in years, they sat together on the same couch, not as a father and a son separated by pride, but as two lives finally meeting in the middle. The strings hummed as David tuned them, each note rising like a small resurrection. Ethan listened with a heart stitched back together by truth, forgiveness, and love that had never stopped waiting. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, something mended. A father played, a son learned, a wound healed. And somewhere, quietly, gently, the photograph that had broken a young man's pride also became the picture that rebuilt their world.